I was a decorated Army officer. My son moved me to the attic for my safety. My health wasn't failing, but his patience was. I looked out from the tiny window, watching him host backyard parties in the home I'd paid off 30 years ago. The same home he now claimed needed my signature for refinancing. When I discovered the papers weren't for refinancing but for transferring ownership, I made one call. By the next month, the house was sold, and all he inherited were the stairs to an empty attic. Wait, before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe if you believe in standing up for yourself, no matter your age. Margaret Caldwell stood at the dormer window of what had once been storage space and was now, apparently, her bedroom. The sloped ceiling meant she could stand upright only in the center of the room. A twin bed pressed against one wall, a small dresser against another. The only decoration was her service photo from 1982, propped against a lamp. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the October chill seep through. Below, her son David was setting up for another one of his weekend gatherings. String lights crisscrossed the backyard. A rented bar stood in one corner. The patio furniture she'd bought 5 summers ago had been rearranged to accommodate at least 20 guests. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been moved upstairs for safety concerns after her knee surgery, yet somehow she was well enough to use the narrow, steep attic stairs multiple times a day. But not well enough, apparently, to continue occupying the master bedroom on the main floor. The bedroom that now belonged to David and his wife, Teresa. Margaret's fingers traced the outline of her reflection in the window. At 58, she wasn't young, but she wasn't elderly either. 22 years in the Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. 2 tours in Desert Storm. A bronze star that now sat in a box under her bed because Teresa thought military memorabilia was too masculine for the living room decor. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "Can you stay upstairs tonight? Having some colleagues over. Don't want you to have to navigate around strangers." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She'd been navigating around strangers her entire military career. Led teams through hostile territories. Coordinated evacuations under enemy fire. But apparently, a gathering of suburban professionals posed an insurmountable challenge. She typed back, "I'll need dinner brought up." Not because she couldn't manage the stairs, but because she wanted to see if he would remember. 3 hours passed. Music drifted up through the floorboards. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the smell of grilled steaks, her favorite, wafted through. The heating vent. No dinner arrived. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, knees aching from the day's physical therapy. She'd been living in her son's home, her home, for 3 months now. After her knee replacement, David had insisted she move in temporarily. Temporarily had stretched when he convinced her to let him handle her finances during recovery. She reached for the small refrigerator tucked under the eaves, another safety measure, so she wouldn't have to navigate to the kitchen at night. Inside was a yogurt, an apple, and a bottle of water. Dinner, apparently. As she ate, she scrolled through her phone, pausing at an image posted by her daughter-in-law. It was their backyard, beautifully lit, captioned, "Another perfect evening in our home sweet home. Blessed while entertaining goals are home." Margaret stared at those 2 words until they blurred. She had purchased this house in 1992, after her first marriage ended. Raised David here as a single mother while balancing military career and parenthood. Paid off the mortgage early using her combat pay. Never remarried, though there had been opportunities. Her focus had been providing stability for her son and serving her country. The floor creaked as she stood, making her way to the small desk where she kept important papers. Her knee protested, but she ignored it. Physical discomfort was an old friend. Emotional betrayal was proving harder to endure. From the bottom drawer, she pulled a folder labeled House Documents. She'd asked David about these papers last week, and he'd been evasive. Just some refinancing stuff, Mom. Market rates are good right now. I'm handling it. Margaret may have surrendered her bedroom, but she hadn't surrendered her mental acuity. 22 years of military intelligence had taught her to question vague answers. She opened the folder and began to read. The documents weren't for refinancing. They were for transferring ownership to David, with Margaret retaining a life interest in the property, specifically the attic conversion. There was a sticky note in David's handwriting on the signature page. Have Mom sign when she's having a good day. A good day, as if she were suffering from dementia instead of recovering from orthopedic surgery. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she replaced the papers. Her military training had taught her to process shock without displaying it, to assess situations calmly, to develop strategies rather than react emotionally. She made her way to the window again. Below, David was showing someone around the yard, gesturing expansively toward the oak tree Margaret had planted when he was born. The party was in full swing. No one looked up at the small attic window. No one remembered the woman who had made it all possible. Margaret picked up her phone again and opened her contacts. She scrolled past David's name, past Teresa's. Her thumb hovered over a name she hadn't called in years, Colonel James Wright, retired. Her former commanding officer, now a real estate attorney. She pressed call. Maggie Caldwell. The voice that answered was warm, surprised. It's been what, 5 years? 7, she corrected. Since the retirement ceremony. What can I do for you, Lieutenant Colonel? She smiled at the use of her rank. It had been a while since anyone had acknowledged that part of her identity. Need a property consultation, she said, and perhaps some advice on family matters. There was a pause, then a chuckle. Those usually go hand in hand in my experience. How about coffee tomorrow? I'll come to you. Not here, Margaret said quickly. I'll meet you at your office. She ended the call and sat back on the bed, wincing as her knee straightened. Below, the party continued, oblivious to the strategic planning happening above. Margaret had led missions with less intelligence and more obstacles. This would require precision, patience, and the willingness to make difficult choices. All skills the Army had honed in her over 2 decades. The next morning, she waited until David and Teresa left for work. They hadn't checked on her before. Leaving, they rarely did these days. She packed a small bag with essentials, her military ID and the house documents. The stairs were challenging, but she managed them methodically, one step at a time, the way she'd approached every obstacle in her career. The Uber arrived promptly at 9:15. The driver, a young woman with bright blue hair, raised an eyebrow at Margaret's careful descent of the front steps but said nothing beyond a friendly greeting. Veterans Affairs Building, please, Margaret directed, settling her bag beside her. Meeting someone? The driver asked conversationally. Margaret smiled. No, reclaiming something. At the VA office, Margaret bypassed the general assistant's desk and headed straight for the Veterans Services officer she'd worked with after retirement. Maria Gonzalez looked up from her computer and broke into a wide smile. Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell, it's been too long. Margaret eased herself into the chair across from Maria's desk. I've been accommodating family, she said carefully. Maria's smile faded slightly. She'd been in this role long enough to recognize the subtle signals of a veteran in distress. What can I help you with today? Margaret placed her folder on the desk. I need to understand my housing options, and I may need temporary assistance while I sort out a situation. For the next hour, Maria outlined the resources available. Veterans housing programs, financial assistance for qualified former officers, medical support that went beyond what Margaret was currently receiving through her son's management of her care. There's also the reverse mortgage option for your property, Maria suggested. That would provide immediate funds while allowing you to remain in your home. That's actually why I'm here, Margaret said, sliding the transfer documents across the desk. I need to ensure these haven't been processed without my knowledge. Maria skimmed the papers, her expression darkening. These aren't legal without your signature, but the intent is concerning. She looked up. Has there been pressure to sign? Margaret thought about the sticky note, the attic bedroom, the safety concerns that somehow never applied to her navigating steep stairs with a new knee replacement. Let's say there's been a strategic repositioning of resources, she replied, drawing on her military terminology. Including me. Maria nodded, understanding the subtext. She'd seen this before. Families who viewed veteran parents as assets to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. I can connect you with our legal team, she offered. And in the meantime, we have transitional housing available if you need to relocate quickly. Margaret considered this. I have a meeting with a real estate attorney this afternoon, a former colleague, but I'd appreciate the housing information as a contingency plan. As she left the VA office with a folder of resources, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of command, of options, of strategy rather than surrender. The coffee shop where she met James Wright was quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a tailor shop. He was already there when her Uber dropped her off, rising to greet her with the formal respect of one officer to another. Lieutenant Colonel, he said, holding her chair. It's just Margaret now, she replied, though the acknowledgement of her rank felt like reclaiming part of herself. James had aged well, silver threading through his dark hair, posture still military straight. So, he said after they'd ordered, tell me what's happening. Margaret did, concisely and without emotional embellishment, the way she would have delivered a field report. The knee surgery, the gradual relocation to the attic, the discovery of the transfer documents, the isolation from her finances and social connections. James listened without interruption, occasionally noting something in a small leather-bound notebook. When she finished, he closed the notebook and met her eyes directly. What you're describing has elements of elder abuse, Margaret. And attempted property fraud. She flinched at the term elder, but nodded. I suspected as much, but wanted a legal perspective. What do you want to happen? He asked. We could file charges, contest any financial moves they've made, secure a restraining order if necessary. Margaret considered this. She thought about David as a child, learning to ride a bike in the driveway of the house he now claimed as his own. She remembered his graduation, his wedding. Somewhere along the way, her son had stopped seeing her as the strong, capable officer who had provided for him and started seeing her as an inconvenience, an asset to be managed, a signature required. I want to sell the house, she said finally. Before they can transfer it, I want to use those funds to secure my future on my terms, and I want them to understand what they've lost. James nodded slowly. Not revenge, he clarified. Consequences. Exactly, Margaret replied. In the military, we learn that actions have outcomes. This is simply a tactical reality check. A smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth. I know several realtors who work specifically with veteran clients. We could have the house on the market within a week, given the current demand in your neighborhood. And if David protests? He lives there after all. He lives there at your discretion, James corrected. Without a completed transfer or any rental agreement, he remains legally your tenant. One you can evict with proper notice. Margaret didn't want to evict her son, but she also didn't want to live in her own attic, watching through a tiny window as he claimed her life's investment as his own. Let's start with a market analysis, she decided. And I'll need a secure place to stay once this begins. I suspect the attic will become considerably less comfortable when they realize what's happening. James made a note. I have a guest house, military-grade security system, first-floor bedroom, no stairs required. It's yours for as long as you need it. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a weight lifting. Not just the physical burden of navigating an unsuitable living space, but the emotional weight of being diminished in a home she had created. "Thank you, Colonel," she said formally. He inclined his head in acknowledgement of both her gratitude and her return to military address. "We take care of our own, Lieutenant Colonel. Always have. Always will." As they finalized their plans, Margaret's phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from David, each more demanding than the last. "Where are you? Why didn't you tell anyone you were leaving? There are papers here that need your signature ASAP. Mom, answer me. We're worried." Margaret read each message but didn't respond. For 3 months, they had reduced her world to an attic room and expected gratitude for it. They had planned to secure her home through manipulation. They had rewritten her story from decorated officer to doddering parent. Now she would write the final chapter herself, and it would begin not with surrender, but with strategy. Colonel Wright's guest house was nothing like the attic. Located behind his colonial-style home in a gated community, it offered what Margaret hadn't realized she'd been missing: dignity. A ground-floor bedroom with an adjoining bathroom equipped with safety rails that didn't announce themselves as medical equipment. A kitchen with counters at the right height for someone still rebuilding strength. Most importantly, windows that faced a garden rather than overlooking a life being lived without her. "Military precision," James had said when showing her the space. "Function without sacrificing aesthetics." He'd redesigned it after his own mother had come to live with him following a stroke. She'd stayed until her passing 3 years ago. "She was a lieutenant in Vietnam," he added. "Never would have forgiven me if I'd treated her like she was fragile." Margaret unpacked her small bag, arranging her service medals in their display case on the bureau. Her phone continued to buzz with notifications, but she'd muted all but emergency contacts. According to James, this was now a tactical operation, and maintaining communication discipline was essential. The real estate agent arrived at 4, a brisk woman named Valerie, who had served as a sergeant in Army intelligence before becoming one of the top-selling agents in the county. "Colonel Wright briefed me on the situation," she said after introductions. No sympathy in her tone, just professional efficiency. "I've already pulled comps for your neighborhood. The market's hot right now. Low inventory, high demand. Your location near the good school district adds significant value." Margaret studied the printouts Valerie provided. The suggested listing price was almost 3 times what she'd paid for the house in 1992. Even accounting for inflation, it represented a substantial return on investment. "How quickly can we move?" Margaret asked. "I can have a photographer at the property tomorrow if you provide access. Listing live by Friday. Given the market, I'd expect multiple offers within the first weekend." "David and Teresa work Thursdays," Margaret noted. "The house will be empty from 8 to 6, Valerie nodded. "Perfect. I'll schedule everything for 10 a.m. She hesitated, then added, "They'll be notified of the listing as occupants. Legally, we're required to give them reasonable notice for showings." "I understand," Margaret replied. "I'm not trying to ambush them, just establishing boundaries they chose to ignore." After Valerie left, Margaret sat on the patio, watching hummingbirds dart between feeders James had positioned among flowering shrubs. Her knee ached less here, perhaps because she wasn't constantly climbing stairs, or perhaps because stress had been amplifying her physical discomfort. Her phone rang, a number she recognized. Not David or Teresa, but her daughter-in-law's mother, Elaine. Margaret had always maintained a cordial relationship with her, despite Teresa's obvious disdain for military life. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Elaine." "Margaret, thank ye. Goodness, everyone's worried sick about you. David said you disappeared without telling anyone." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "I left a note on the kitchen counter, and I'm hardly disappeared. I'm staying with a friend while I sort out some housing issues." "Housing issues? But you're living with David and Teresa. They've done up that lovely attic space for you." David showed me the pictures. Of course he had, probably presented it as a generous accommodation rather than an exile. It was temporary while I recovered from surgery, Margaret explained. But my knee is improving, and it's time I had my own space again. She kept her tone neutral, informational, rather than accusatory. Well, that's just silly, Elaine replied. At your age, living alone isn't practical. David's concerned about your cognitive judgment, you know. Said you've been confused about financial matters lately. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. My cognitive function is excellent, Elaine. My financial judgment sound enough to have provided David with a debt-free home and a fully funded college education. No need to get defensive, Elaine backpedaled. Slightly. We all want what's best for you. Why don't you come back and discuss this as a family? Teresa's making pot roast tonight. The attempted manipulation was so transparent it almost made Margaret laugh. Return for pot roast. Sign away your home while chewing. Please tell them I'm fine and will be in touch when I've made my arrangements, Margaret said firmly. And Elaine, if David mentions any papers that need my signature, I'd appreciate you suggesting he speak directly with my attorney. She ended the call before Elaine could respond. Direct, clear communication. No emotional hooks. Another lesson from her military. Years that served her well now. That evening, James joined her for dinner, bringing takeout from a Vietnamese restaurant they'd both frequented during their active duty years. Your son called my office, he mentioned as they ate. Apparently, he found my business card in your room and assumed I was handling the refinancing. Margaret set down her fork. What did you tell him? That client confidentiality prevented me from discussing any legal matters without your explicit permission. James smiled slightly. He didn't take it well. He's used to having access to all my information, Margaret said. He's been managing my accounts since the surgery. James's expression darkened. We'll need to address that immediately. Financial control is a common element in these situations. First thing tomorrow, we're visiting your bank to secure your accounts. Margaret nodded, feeling a familiar mix of tactical focus and personal discomfort. This was her son they were discussing, not an adversary. Yet his actions had placed them in opposition. I keep asking myself where I went wrong, she admitted. What I did to make him see me as a burden rather than a parent. James shook his head. This isn't about your parenting, Margaret. It's about opportunity and entitlement. You provided well, perhaps too well. The house became an asset he felt entitled to rather than your home. Still, the attic... She couldn't finish the sentence. The humiliation still felt too raw. Was strategic, James completed her thought. Isolate, diminish, control, basic tactics, deployed against someone he assumed wouldn't recognize them. But I trained him to be better than that, Margaret insisted. To have integrity, to respect others. You did, James agreed. But somewhere along the way, other influences became stronger. He paused. Have you considered that Teresa might be the driving force here? Margaret thought about her daughter-in-law's designer purses, her frequent comments about needing more space, her dismissal of Margaret's military career as that army thing you did. It doesn't matter who initiated it, she said finally. David made his choice. Now I'm making mine. The following day unfolded with military precision. First, the bank, where Margaret revoked David's access to her accounts, discovering in the process that he'd been siphoning her retirement payments into a separate account in his name for safekeeping. I'd like to press charges, she told the bank manager, her voice steady. The woman looked uncomfortable. It's complicated with family members who have account access. The police often consider it a civil rather than criminal matter. Note my request in the file, Margaret insisted, and freeze all transfers initiated by anyone but me. Next came the meeting with Valerie, who reported that the photographer had completed the listing photos. The house shows beautifully, she said, displaying the images on her tablet. Though I did have to ask the occupants to temporarily vacate during the shoot. Margaret stiffened. They were home. Mrs. Caldwell, Teresa, arrived midway through. She was quite upset about the photography. Said there must be some mistake. Valerie's expression remained neutral. I informed her that the property owner had authorized the listing. How did she respond? She made several phone calls in another room, then left. She seemed distressed. Margaret had expected this, had prepared for it tactically, yet emotionally, knowing that her actions had created distress for her family still affected her. By late afternoon, her phone was buzzing constantly. David, Teresa, even a few names she didn't recognize, likely friends they'd enlisted to apply pressure. She didn't respond. Not yet. The boundaries she was establishing required clarity, and clarity required the right moment, the right environment. The real estate agent arrived at 4, a brisk woman named Valerie who had served as a sergeant in Army intelligence before becoming one of the top-selling agents in the county. Colonel Wright briefed me on the situation, she said after introductions. No sympathy in her tone, just professional efficiency. I've already pulled comps for your neighborhood. The market's hot right now. Low inventory, high demand. Your location near the Good School District adds significant value. Margaret studied the printouts Valerie provided. The suggested listing price was almost 3 times what she'd paid for the house in 1992. Even accounting for inflation, it represented a substantial return on investment. How quickly can we move? Margaret asked. I can have a photographer at the property tomorrow if you provide access. Listing live by Friday. Given the market, I'd expect multiple offers within the first weekend. David and Teresa work Thursdays, Margaret noted. The house will be empty from 8 to 6. Valerie nodded. Perfect. I'll schedule everything for 10 a.m. She hesitated, then added, they'll be notified of the listing as occupants. Legally, we're required to give them reasonable notice for showings. I understand, Margaret replied. I'm not trying to ambush them, just establishing boundaries they chose to ignore. After Valerie left, Margaret sat on the patio, watching hummingbirds dart between feeders James had positioned among flowering shrubs. Her knee ached less here, perhaps because she wasn't constantly climbing stairs, or perhaps because stress had been amplifying her physical discomfort. Her phone rang, a number she recognized. Not David or Teresa, but her daughter-in-law's mother, Elaine. Margaret had always maintained a cordial relationship with her, despite Teresa's obvious disdain for military life. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello, Elaine. Margaret. Thank goodness. Everyone's worried sick about you. David said you disappeared without telling anyone. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I left a note on the kitchen counter. And I'm hardly disappeared. I'm staying with a friend while I sort out some housing issues. Housing issues? But you're living with David and Teresa. They've done up that lovely attic space for you. David showed me the pictures. Of course he had. Probably presented it as a generous accommodation rather than an exile. It was temporary while I recovered from surgery, Margaret explained. But my knee is improving, and it's time I had my own space again. She kept her tone neutral, informational, rather than accusatory. Well, that's just silly, Elaine replied. At your age, living alone isn't practical. David's concerned about your cognitive judgment, you know. Said you've been confused about financial matters lately. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. My cognitive function is excellent, Elaine. My financial judgment sound enough to have provided David with a debt-free home and a fully funded college education. No need to get defensive, Elaine backpedaled. Slightly. We all want what's best for you. Why don't you come back and discuss this as a family? Teresa's making pot roast tonight. The attempted manipulation was so transparent it almost made Margaret laugh. Return for pot roast, sign away your home while chewing. Please tell them I'm fine and will be in touch when I've made my arrangements, Margaret said firmly. And Elaine, if David mentions any papers that need my signature, I'd appreciate you suggesting he speak directly with my attorney. She ended the call before Elaine could respond. Direct, clear communication. No emotional hooks. Another lesson from her military. Years that served her well now. That evening, James joined her for dinner, bringing takeout from a Vietnamese restaurant they'd both frequented during their active duty years. "Your son called my office," he mentioned as they ate. "Apparently, he found my business card in your room and assumed I was handling the refinancing." Margaret set down her fork. "What did you tell him?" "That client confidentiality prevented me from discussing any legal matters without your explicit permission." James smiled slightly. "He didn't take it well." "He's used to having access to all my information," Margaret said. "He's been managing my accounts since the surgery." James's expression darkened. "We'll need to address that immediately. Financial control is a common element in these situations. First thing tomorrow, we're visiting your bank to secure your accounts." Margaret nodded, feeling a familiar mix of tactical focus and personal discomfort. This was her son they were discussing, not an adversary, yet his actions had placed them in opposition. "I keep asking myself where I went wrong," she admitted. "What I did to make him see me as a burden rather than a parent." James shook his head. "This isn't about your parenting, Margaret. It's about opportunity and entitlement. You provided well, perhaps too well. The house became an asset he felt entitled to rather than your home. Still, the attic—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The humiliation still felt too raw. "Was strategic," James completed her thought. "Isolate, diminish, control. Basic tactics deployed against someone he assumed wouldn't recognize them. But I trained him to be better than that," Margaret insisted. "To have integrity, to respect others." "You did," James agreed. "But somewhere along the way, other influences became stronger." He paused. "Have you considered that Teresa might be the driving force here?" Margaret thought about her daughter-in-law's designer purses, her frequent comments about needing more space, her dismissal of Margaret's military career as "that army thing you did." "It doesn't matter who initiated it," she said finally. "David made his choice. Now I'm making mine." The following day unfolded with military precision. First, the bank, where Margaret revoked David's access to her accounts, discovering in the process that he'd been siphoning her retirement payments into a separate account in his name for safekeeping. "I'd like to press charges," she told the bank manager, her voice steady. The woman looked uncomfortable. "It's complicated with family members who have account access. The police often consider it a civil rather than criminal matter." "Note my request in the file," Margaret insisted, "and freeze all transfers initiated by anyone but me." Next came the meeting with Valerie, who reported that the photographer had completed the listing photos. "The house shows beautifully," she said, displaying the images on her tablet. "Though I did have to ask the occupants to temporarily vacate during the shoot." Margaret stiffened. They were home. Mrs. Caldwell, Teresa, arrived midway through. She was quite upset about the photography, said there must be some mistake. Valerie's expression remained neutral. I informed her that the property owner had authorized the listing. How did she respond? She made several phone calls in another room, then left. She seemed distressed. Margaret had expected this, had prepared for it tactically. Yet emotionally, knowing that her actions had created distress for her family still affected her. By late afternoon, her phone was buzzing constantly. David. Teresa. Even a few names she didn't recognize, likely friends they'd enlisted to apply pressure. She didn't respond. Not yet. The boundaries she was establishing required clarity, and clarity required the right moment, the right environment. That moment came sooner than expected. As she and James returned from a meeting with her financial advisor, a vehicle was parked in his driveway. David's SUV, the one he'd purchased using the bonus from his promotion last year. The promotion Margaret had celebrated by taking the family to dinner at the restaurant where the entrees cost more than her first month's military salary. "Would you like me to ask him to leave?" James offered, his posture shifting subtly into protective mode. Margaret shook her head. No, it's time we talked, but I'd appreciate you being nearby. David was pacing on the front porch, his normally styled hair disheveled, his expression thunderous. When he saw Margaret in the passenger seat, he strode toward the car, yanking. Open her door before she could properly exit. What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his voice sharp enough to carry across the quiet neighborhood. You disappear? You list our house without consulting anyone. You lock me out of the accounts I've been managing for you. Margaret took her time getting out of the car, making sure her footing was secure before facing her son. James positioned himself just behind her right shoulder, present but not intervening. Hello, David, she said calmly. I see you found me. Found you? I had to hire a private investigator. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? How irrational this looks, Margaret met his gaze steadily. Moving me to an attic with dangerous stairs while I recovered from knee surgery? Was that rational? Planning to transfer my home into your name without proper discussion? Was that rational? David's expression flickered, surprise giving way to defensiveness. The attic is perfectly safe. We spent thousands converting it for you, and the transfer was for estate planning purposes, to protect you. From what exactly? Margaret asked. Financial independence? Personal autonomy? The dignity of living in the home I paid for? You're twisting everything, David insisted, lowering his voice as he noticed a neighbor walking a dog nearby. We were taking care of you. That's what family does. Family doesn't isolate vulnerable members in attics, Margaret replied. Family doesn't prepare documents to be signed on good days, as if I were cognitively impaired. Family doesn't treat a parent's home as an inheritance before she's even ill. David's face flushed. This is Teresa's influence, isn't it? You've never liked her, never approved of her spending or her priorities. This is you punishing us. This is me protecting myself, Margaret corrected. And if financial consequences feel like punishment, perhaps that reveals more about your intentions than mine. You can't sell the house, David said, his tone shifting to one she recognized, the voice he used when negotiating, when trying to control outcomes. Think about what people will say, about how this looks, a mother throwing her son and his wife onto the street. Margaret almost smiled at the dramatic phrasing. You have excellent jobs, substantial savings, and more than enough notice to find appropriate housing. You're hardly on the street. We've made improvements to that house. Investments. You deserve exactly what you earned, Margaret interrupted, her patience thinning. And what you earn through manipulation is nothing. David's expression hardened. So that's it? 30 years of family just erased because you're feeling slighted about bedroom arrangements? Not erased, David. Recalibrated. Margaret's voice softened slightly. I will always be your mother, but I will never again be someone you can relocate to an attic and expect gratitude for it. She took a step toward the house, signaling that the conversation was ending. David reached for her arm, not roughly, but with the presumption of control that had characterized their interactions since her surgery. Mom, please, let's just go home and discuss this rationally. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. Margaret looked pointedly at his hand until he released her arm. I am home, David. Not in your attic. Not in your amended version of my life story. Here, making decisions that honor who I am rather than who you've decided I should be. She turned away, James falling into step beside her as they walked to the front door. Behind them, David called out, This isn't over. You're making a huge mistake. Inside, Margaret settled on the couch, the confrontation having drained more energy than she'd anticipated. James disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses of water. You handled that well, he observed. Clear boundaries, no escalation. Margaret sipped the water, trying to ease the tightness in her throat. It doesn't feel well handled. It feels like failure. Not yours, James said firmly. Sometimes the best strategic victory is recognizing which battles cannot be won through conventional engagement. He's still my son, Margaret said quietly. Despite everything. Yes, James agreed. And perhaps someday he'll be worthy of the mother who raised him. But that's his journey to make, not yours to force. That evening, Margaret received a text from Teresa, the first direct communication from her daughter-in-law in months. It contained only a photo. The attic room, door now fitted with an external lock. No caption needed. The message was clear. Her place in their home, her home, had become a prisoner's cell rather than a sanctuary. Had she returned as David requested, she might have found herself not merely isolated, but confined. Margaret showed the image to James, who photographed it with his own phone. Evidence, he said simply. Should we need it? That night, alone in the guest house bedroom, Margaret finally allowed herself to cry. Not for the house she was selling, it was just wood and stone after all, but for the family that had been revealed in its true form through this process, for the son who had looked at her service photo every day of his childhood, but somehow forgotten the strength it represented. For the years she'd believed that sacrifice would be met with respect rather than exploitation. She cried, but she did not waver. Tomorrow, the listing would go live. Viewings would begin. And the home that had become a battlefield would be transformed into the foundation for her new life, one constructed on her terms, not relegated to an attic. The listing went live on Friday morning. By noon, Valerie had scheduled 17 viewings for the weekend and received 3 preemptive offers sight unseen. It's the location, she explained during their update call. Corner lot, established neighborhood, good schools. Plus, your timing is perfect. Inventory is at record lows. Margaret listened with mixed emotions. The house had never been just an investment to her. It represented security earned through years of service, deployments spent dreaming of home, a sanctuary created for her and her son. Now it was being described in square footage and comparable sales, its value measured not in memories, but market trends. The occupants are being difficult, Valerie added delicately. Mrs. Caldwell, Teresa, has declined several showing requests and informed my assistant that the house isn't actually for sale. Does that present a legal problem? Margaret asked, shifting in her chair to ease her knee. No. As the owner, you have the right to sell regardless of occupant preferences. But it could complicate viewings if they're uncooperative. James, who had been listening while reviewing documents at his desk, looked up. We could request a court order compelling them to allow access, but that would delay the process. Alternatively, we could offer an incentive for cooperation. What kind of incentive? Margaret asked. Financial, James said simply. A percentage of proceeds designated for relocation expenses, contingent on their facilitating a smooth sale. Margaret considered this. She wasn't vindictive by nature. Her goal was independence, not retribution. 10%, she decided, contingent on their full cooperation and vacating the property within 30 days of closing. Valerie raised an eyebrow. That's generous. Given the expected sale price, we're talking about a substantial sum. I'm not interested in leaving them without options, Margaret clarified. I just won't be one of those options any longer. James drafted the offer that afternoon. 10% of net proceeds after closing costs, contingent on cooperation with all showings and inspections, and the property being vacated in broom-clean condition 30 days after closing. No contact with Margaret except through legal representatives. No removal of fixtures or permanent installations. This demonstrates good faith while establishing clear expectations, he explained as Margaret reviewed the document. It also creates a financial incentive that directly correlates with sale price. The better the house shows, the more they stand to gain. Margaret signed without hesitation. She understood incentive structures, had implemented them throughout her military career. People responded to clear directives paired with commensurate rewards. The response came faster than expected. Not from David, but from Teresa's father, a corporate attorney Margaret had met only a handful of times at family gatherings. "Ms. Caldwell," he began when she answered his call, deliberately omitting her military rank. "I'm hoping we can discuss this real estate situation like reasonable adults." Margaret straightened in her chair, automatically adjusting her posture as if preparing for inspection. "I believe my offer was quite reasonable, Mr. Harrington. 10% is generous by any standard." "It's not the percentage that concerns us," he replied. "It's the principle. David and Teresa have invested considerably in that property. New kitchen appliances, bathroom renovations, landscaping. Their sweat equity alone? Improvements to a home they lived in rent-free," Margaret interrupted. "At my invitation, which has now been rescinded." There was a pause. "They've built their lives around that location, their social connections, their professional network. This sudden decision to sell seems impulsive. Moving me to an attic and attempting to transfer my property without proper consent, those were impulsive actions," Margaret countered. "My response has been measured and legally sound." "Margaret," his tone shifted, becoming more personal. "We're concerned about your well-being. These erratic decisions, disappearing without notice, financial actions that jeopardize your security, these suggest you might benefit from more structured support." The implication was clear, and it sent a chill through Margaret's spine. They were laying groundwork to challenge her competence, to potentially seek guardianship or conservatorship. "Mr. Harrington," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Last month I completed a full neuropsychological evaluation at the VA Medical Center. I've also been examined by 2 independent physicians who have documented my cognitive function as entirely normal for my age. My financial decisions have been reviewed by both my attorney and a certified financial planner. If you're suggesting otherwise, I recommend extreme caution." Another pause, longer this time. "No one wants this to become adversarial." "It became adversarial when your daughter and my son decided my home belonged in their asset column before I was even ill. The offer stands. 10% contingent on cooperation. I suggest they take it before I reconsider its generosity." After ending the call, Margaret found her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a cold anger she rarely permitted herself to feel. They had not only tried to take her home, but were now attempting to question her mental capacity. James found her an hour later in the garden, methodically deadheading roses with more force than the task required. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting the pile of severed blooms. "They're positioning to challenge my competence," Margaret said without looking up. "Teresa's father called. Implied I'm making erratic decisions that suggest I need structured support." James nodded, unsurprised. "Standard tactic when financial control is threatened. We're prepared for it." "Are we?" Margaret asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Because it feels like I'm fighting my own family for the right to exist independently." "You are," James said simply. "And yes, we're prepared. Your medical evaluations, financial reviews, the documented attempt to transfer your property, the attic relocation despite medical advice about stairs after knee surgery, it all builds a clear pattern. Not of your incompetence, but of their attempted exploitation." Margaret resumed her gardening, finding the repetitive motion soothing. "I never imagined retirement would include legal battles with my own son." "The hardest enemies to defend against are those who know your vulnerabilities," James observed, "and family knows them best." By evening, Teresa's father had emailed James, accepting the offer with one additional request, that Margaret meet with David and Teresa in person, with attorneys present, to discuss the transition. James forwarded the email with a single question mark. "No, Margaret replied after considering it briefly. Any meeting would be an opportunity for emotional manipulation. All communication should remain in writing. She was learning to trust her instincts again, to recognize when seemingly reasonable requests concealed tactical objectives. A face-to-face meeting would allow them to appeal to familial bonds, to perhaps wear down her resolve through emotional appeals that had no place in a legal proceeding. The weekend brought a flurry of activity. 22 showings, 5 offers, all above asking price. Valerie reported that David and Teresa had reluctantly accommodated the viewings, though Teresa had followed prospective buyers through the house, pointing out problems that needed disclosure, most manufactured or exaggerated. "It hasn't deterred interest," Valerie assured Margaret. "If anything, buyers seem sympathetic when I explain you're a veteran reclaiming your financial independence." That small detail, her veteran status, seemed to resonate with potential buyers. 3 of the offers came from military families who appreciated the home's proximity to the base. One couple included a personal letter mentioning their respect for her service and their desire to continue the home's legacy as a place where service members could put down roots. Margaret found herself drawn to their offer, though it wasn't the highest. Something about maintaining the connection to military life appealed to her, a sense that the home's next chapter would honor its history. On Sunday evening, as Margaret reviewed the offers with Valerie and James, her phone buzzed, with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it until she saw the preview contained a single word: Mom. The full message read, "Mom, it's David. Using Mike's phone since you're not answering mine. Please don't do this. We can work something out that doesn't involve strangers in our home. I'm sorry about the attic. We can convert the den for you. Instead, 1st floor, private bathroom. Please just come home so we can talk." Margaret stared at the message, feeling the pull of maternal instinct warring with hard-earned wisdom. The offer of a 1st-floor room was telling. They had always had that option but had chosen the attic instead. Only now, with their financial interests threatened, did a more suitable arrangement materialize. She showed the message to James, who read it without comment, then handed the phone back. "Your call," he said simply. Margaret typed a response, deleted it, then tried again. Finally, she settled on, "David, all communication should go through our attorneys. The time for these discussions was before you moved me to an attic for my safety, while preparing documents to take my home. I'm not angry. I'm awake." She turned off her phone afterward, unwilling to be drawn into a text exchange that could only serve to destabilize her resolve. The offers needed her attention now, practical matters rather than emotional entanglements. By Monday morning, Margaret had decided to accept the military family's offer, contingent on a quick closing and the standard home inspection. Valerie submitted the paperwork, and by afternoon, they were officially under contract. "Congratulations," James said when she told him. "How does it feel?" Margaret considered the question. "Bittersweet," she admitted. "I'm relieved to be moving forward, but I'm mourning what I've lost. Not the house, the illusion of family as I thought it was." James nodded. "The hardest losses are often invisible to others. Not possessions, but assumptions." That evening, Margaret felt restless. The guest house, comfortable as it was, still felt temporary, liminal, a space between chapters rather than a home. She decided to take a short walk, testing her improving knee strength while clearing her mind. The neighborhood was quiet, sprinklers hissing on manicured lawns, porch lights creating pools of warm illumination in the gathering dusk. As she rounded the corner near James's driveway, she noticed a car parked across the street. Teresa's white sedan, unmistakable with its personalized license plate, TRS BMW. Margaret paused, considering her options. She could return to the guest house, avoid the confrontation entirely. She could call James for backup, or she could face this directly, on her terms, in neutral territory. She chose the third option, crossing to the car with measured steps. Teresa was alone, scrolling through her phone. She looked up with a start when Margaret tapped on the window, her expression cycling rapidly from surprise to wariness, to a practiced smile as she lowered the glass. "Margaret, I was just in the neighborhood. 40 minutes from your house," Margaret observed mildly. "That's quite a neighborhood." Teresa's smile faltered. "I thought maybe we could talk, woman to woman. This situation is getting out of hand, and David is struggling." "Is he?" Margaret asked. "Or is he simply experiencing consequences?" Teresa's facade cracked slightly. "Look, I know you're upset about the attic. It wasn't ideal, but we were trying to help. You needed supervision after your surgery." "Supervision that somehow required isolation rather than accessibility," Margaret noted. "Strange how my safety concerns vanished when I objected to signing over my home." Teresa's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "That was David's father's idea. He thought it would simplify things for estate planning. I told him it was too soon, but he insisted—" "Please don't lie to me," Margaret interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "I've seen the text messages between you and David discussing the transfer. I've seen the notes about having me sign on good days. I've seen the listing photos where my bedroom was already being converted to your home office before any papers were signed." Teresa's eyes widened. "You've been monitoring our phones? The cloud account was still linked to my devices," Margaret explained. "An oversight on David's part, I suppose. Technology can be challenging for younger generations, too." The irony hung between them, undercutting months of comments about Margaret's supposed technological incompetence. "What do you want?" Teresa asked finally, her pretense of friendly concern evaporating. "Money? Is that it? Because selling the house out from under us is extreme, even if you were offended by the arrangements." "What I wanted was respect," Margaret replied. "Consideration, the dignity of being seen as a person rather than a problem. But since those weren't available, I'll settle for independence." "You're punishing us for trying to help you," Teresa insisted, "making us homeless over a misunderstanding." Margaret studied her daughter-in-law's face, the practiced victimhood, the careful phrasing that inverted reality. It was skillful manipulation, likely effective in many contexts. But Margaret had interrogated enemy combatants. She recognized deflection strategies. "You have 2 successful careers, substantial savings, and 10% of the sale proceeds coming your way," she pointed out. "You're hardly homeless. And it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a miscalculation. You assumed—" "I was too diminished to recognize what was happening." Teresa's expression hardened. "David was right. You've changed. Become bitter, suspicious. Maybe that attic room was affecting your thinking more than we realized." "Or maybe it clarified it," Margaret suggested. "Isolation has a way of bringing priorities into focus." She stepped back from the car, signaling the end of the conversation. "The house closes in 3 weeks. I suggest you focus your energy on finding new living arrangements rather than continuing failed manipulation attempts." As she walked away, Teresa called after her, "He's still your son. Family is supposed to forgive." Margaret paused, turning slightly. "Forgiveness requires acknowledgement, Teresa, not continued justification. When he's ready to see what actually happened, we can discuss forgiveness." She continued toward the guest house, her steps measured, her back straight. Behind her, Teresa's car engine started with an angry rev before accelerating down the street. Inside, Margaret found James in the kitchen preparing tea. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "Visitor?" he asked, setting out a second cup. "Teresa," Margaret confirmed, easing into a chair. "Parked outside conducting surveillance. We had a brief conversation that accomplished precisely what I expected. Confirmation that no real acknowledgement is forthcoming." James nodded, adding honey to her tea the way she preferred it. Sometimes victory isn't about changing the other person's perspective. It's about clarifying your own. Margaret accepted the cup gratefully, letting its warmth seep into her hands. I keep waiting to feel vindicated. Instead, I just feel clear, like waking from a fog I didn't know I was in. Clarity is its own victory, James observed, especially when others preferred you confused. They sat in companionable silence, sipping tea as the evening settled around them. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus. Inside, Margaret felt the first genuine peace she'd experienced in months. Not happiness exactly. Too much had been lost for simple happiness. But something more valuable, the certainty that came from reclaiming her own narrative. The house would be sold. The proceeds would fund her next chapter. And the stairs to that empty attic would remain the only thing her son had truly earned from the transaction. The inspection revealed what Margaret had already known. The house was fundamentally sound. 30 years of military-grade maintenance had ensured the major systems functioned properly. The roof, replaced 5 years ago after a hailstorm. The HVAC, serviced every spring and fall like clockwork. The foundation, reinforced during a renovation a decade earlier when Margaret had used her retirement bonus to expand the kitchen. Minor issues only, the inspector told Valerie. Some caulking needed in the master bath. Dryer vent requires cleaning. One gutter downspout needs reattachment. Normal wear for a house of its age, easily addressed before closing. What wasn't included in the report were the more personal discoveries. Margaret's military photographs removed from the living room walls, replaced by Teresa's family portraits. The collection of challenge coins Margaret had earned throughout her career, previously displayed in the den, nowhere to be found. The flag presented at her retirement ceremony, once prominently showcased in a custom-built case, apparently relegated to storage. These details emerged through photos taken during the inspection, images Valerie forwarded without comment. Margaret studied them on her tablet, swiping through scenes from a home that had been systematically erased of her presence long before she physically departed. "You should document these items as personal property," James advised when she showed him. "The contract specifies they must return all belongings not included in the sale." Margaret shook her head. "The photographs can be reprinted, the coins and flag." She paused. "Those matter more. I'll have you include them specifically in the final communication." As closing approached, the practical details of Margaret's next chapter required attention. The sale proceeds would be substantial, enough to purchase a new home outright and still maintain a comfortable nest egg. The question was, where? "Have you considered returning to military housing?" Maria asked during their follow-up meeting at the VA office. "There's a new veterans community breaking ground just outside the base, designed specifically for officers transitioning to civilian life or retiring." Margaret reviewed the brochure with interest. The development featured single-story homes with accessibility features integrated so seamlessly they appeared as design elements rather than accommodations. Communal spaces for social gatherings. Security protocols that would feel familiar to anyone with a military background. Most appealing was the location, close enough to her previous neighborhood to maintain connections with friends, far enough to avoid casual encounters with David and Teresa. "There's a 2-year waiting list," Maria warned, "but your veteran status and officer rank would prioritize your application." 2 years. Margaret considered this timeline. "I'll need something interim," she decided. "Somewhere to regroup while I wait." "Colonel Wright mentioned you might be interested in my mother's condo," Valerie offered during their pre-closing meeting. "It's been sitting empty since she moved to assisted living last year. Single-level, gated community, 10 minutes from the VA Medical Center. We've been meaning to sell, but the market hasn't been right." Margaret remembered James mentioning this possibility. "Rental terms?" "Month to month," Valerie said. "No long-term commitment. My mother would be relieved to have someone military keeping an eye on things. She was Navy herself, lieutenant commander, retired 1995. The synchronicity felt right. Another female officer's space, temporarily vacant, bridging Margaret's transition. "I'd like to see it," she said. The condo proved ideal, a ground-floor unit with wide doorways, a walk-in shower already equipped with grab bars, and a small patio overlooking a community garden. The previous occupant's military background was evident in the thoughtful organization of storage spaces and the strategic placement of furniture for maximum efficiency without sacrificing comfort. "Mom would be pleased to know another officer is using her space," Valerie commented as they toured. "She always said civilian housing wasted too many square feet on nonsense." Margaret smiled, recognizing the sentiment. Military life instilled an appreciation for functional design, for spaces that served purposes beyond aesthetics. They agreed on terms that afternoon. Margaret would take occupancy the day after closing, with a 6-month guaranteed rate and month-to-month extensions afterward. Enough time to recover completely from her surgery, adapt to her new circumstances, and plan her next permanent home. 3 days before closing, James received a lengthy email from Teresa's father. The message began professionally enough, acknowledging the sale would proceed as scheduled, but quickly devolved into barely veiled accusations. Margaret's sudden decision raising concerns about her judgment. The family's deep worry about her living independently. Their hope that she would reconsider this rash action before relationships were permanently damaged. James forwarded it with a single question. Response? Margaret considered ignoring it entirely. The closing was set, the terms established, her plans in motion. Further engagement seemed unnecessary at best, potentially destabilizing at worst. Still, leaving such accusations unchallenged felt wrong. Not for her own sake, but for the principle. After 30 years enforcing boundaries on battlefields, she wouldn't allow them to be casually dismissed in civilian life. "Draft a brief response," she instructed James. "Acknowledge receipt. Clarify that my decision followed their actions, not preceded them. Confirm the closing schedule and remind them of the 30-day vacancy requirement. Add that my military service taught me to recognize threats disguised as concern, and I expect no further communication except through proper channels. Professional, direct, final. The boundaries reinforced without emotional escalation." The night before closing, Margaret sat on the guest house patio, reviewing her journey from that first moment of discovery, the transfer documents hidden in her son's desk, to now. The anger had subsided, replaced by a clear-eyed acceptance of what had been revealed rather than what had been lost. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Then another, and another. The first, "Mom, please don't go through with this tomorrow. We can work something out. I'm sorry about the attic." The second, "At least talk to me before you do this. Family shouldn't communicate through lawyers." The third, "If you sell our home, you might not see the grandkids for a long time. Think about what you're doing." The progression was telling. Apology, appeal to family bonds, then thinly veiled threat. Margaret didn't respond to any of them, but she saved screenshots, forwarding them to James with a brief note. "For the file, in case escalation continues after closing." She slept surprisingly well that night, waking before her alarm to sunlight, streaming through gauzy curtains. Today, she would legally sever her connection to the house that had sheltered her through decades of life's transitions. The thought brought not sadness, but a sense of completion. Chapters ended so new ones could begin. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock at James's office, a deliberate choice to maintain neutral territory. Margaret dressed carefully in her civilian best, a tailored navy pantsuit that echoed her military bearing without requiring actual uniform. Small pearl earrings, a silver watch James had given her as a retirement gift, sensible shoes that accommodated her still-healing knee. Valerie arrived first, bringing fresh market flowers and a congratulatory card from the buyers. "They're excited," she reported, already planning which bedroom will be their home office and how to update the landscaping. Margaret appreciated hearing this. The house deserved a family who saw it as a home rather than an asset, who would create their own memories within its walls rather than calculating its market value. James's assistant showed them to the conference room where the closing documents awaited. Everything pre-reviewed, tabbed for signatures, the process streamlined for efficiency. Margaret took her seat at the head of the table, posture perfect, hands folded calmly before her. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened. Instead of the closing attorney, David stood in the doorway. He looked haggard, eyes shadowed from apparent sleeplessness, his usually immaculate business casual attire slightly rumpled. He carried no briefcase, no paperwork, only a small wooden box Margaret recognized immediately, her challenge coins. The special ones, not standard issue but personally presented by commanding officers for exceptional service. The ones that had disappeared from her display case. "Mom," he said, his voice rough. "Please." Just that word. No further argument, no prepared speech. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing beneath the fatigue something she hadn't expected, genuine distress beyond. Financial inconvenience? James rose slightly, a silent question in his expression. Margaret gave a small gesture. "Wait, let me handle this." And he settled back, alert but not intervening. "David," she acknowledged calmly. "The closing attorney will be here shortly. This isn't an appropriate time for discussion." He stepped further into the room, still clutching the wooden box. "I found these in Teresa's closet," he said, "in a storage bin with other things from your room, your service photo, Dad's letters from when you were deployed, the flag from your retirement ceremony." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though her heart quickened slightly at the mention of her late husband's letters. She'd wondered where they had gone. "I didn't know she'd taken them," David continued. "I swear, Mom, I thought you'd packed them yourself when you—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing how implausible this sounded. She had been moved to the attic with only what fit in 2 suitcases. The idea that she'd somehow secreted away her most treasured possessions made no sense. "Where is Teresa now?" Margaret asked, her voice level. "At her parents'," David replied. "We had a fight after I found these. She said she was making room for—" He looked down. "For her home office, in your bedroom." Margaret nodded once, acknowledging what he wasn't quite admitting, that his wife had been systematically erasing Margaret's presence long before the attic relocation, that her exile had been planned, not improvised. "I'm sorry," David said, setting the box carefully on the conference table. "I didn't see what was happening, or maybe I didn't want to see it." The closing attorney appeared in the doorway behind him, briefcase in hand, expression shifting from professional readiness to confusion at finding an unexpected person in the room. "Should we reschedule?" he asked, glancing between Margaret and James. "No," Margaret said firmly. "We'll proceed as planned." She looked at her son. "David, I appreciate the return of my property. Please ensure all remaining items are gathered before the 30-day vacancy period ends. My attorney will provide a specific list." David's expression crumpled slightly. "That's it? 30 years of family reduced to an inventory list?" Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the maternal instinct to comfort, to smooth over, to prioritize relationship preservation above all else. But that instinct had led her to an attic room with a locked door, to isolation justified as protection, to the systematic dismantling of her autonomy. "Our relationship isn't ending, David," she said carefully. "It's changing. I'll always be your mother. But I will never again be someone whose home and dignity are considered negotiable assets." She gestured to the chair across from her. "You're welcome to stay for the closing if you'd like to witness it. The terms include the 10% allocation we discussed, which should assist with your relocation costs." David looked at the offered chair, then back at his mother's composed face. Some realization seemed to dawn, Perhaps that this wasn't a negotiating tactic or emotional leverage, but a boundary years overdue. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But Mom, this isn't over. I mean," he amended quickly, seeing her expression harden. "The house is yours to sell. I understand that now. But us, our family, there has to be a way forward." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "There is. It begins with recognition, not justification. With seeing me as I am, not as a problem to be managed or an asset to be acquired." David nodded, the gesture small but seemingly genuine. "The VA housing development," he said unexpectedly. "Maria told me you're on the waiting list. It's a good choice, secure, near your support network." The fact that he'd sought this information, had spoken to Maria, suggested an effort beyond today's last-minute intervention. Margaret acknowledged this with a slight nod. "We'll talk later," she said. "After the closing. After you've had time to process. My contact information remains the same." After David left, the closing proceeded efficiently. Signatures on multiple copies, notarizations, final instructions regarding utilities and key transfers. Margaret's hand remained steady throughout, her decisions clear, her focus unwavering. When the final document was signed, Valerie handed her a slim envelope. "From the buyers," she explained. "They asked me to give it to you personally." Inside was a handwritten note. "Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell, thank you for entrusting us with your home. As a military family, we understand the sacrifice and service that built this foundation. We promise to honor its history while creating our own chapter here. With deepest respect, Captain Rebecca Chen and family." Margaret read it twice, oddly, moved by this connection with strangers who nevertheless shared a common language of service and sacrifice, who understood that a home was more than square footage and market value. It was a sanctuary earned through deployments spent dreaming of safe return. "It's official," James said as they left the closing, Margaret's copy of the documents securely filed in his briefcase. "Congratulations." Margaret paused on the sidewalk outside his office, looking up at the clear blue sky, feeling the weight of ownership lift from her shoulders. Not with sadness, but with the peculiar lightness that comes from shedding what no longer serves. "What now?" James asked as they walked toward his car. Margaret smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "Now I climb my own stairs, not someone else's." The condo welcomed her like an old friend, though she'd visited only once before. Perhaps it was the military precision of its layout, the functional beauty of spaces designed by someone who understood that form should follow purpose. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that here, no one would question her right to exist on the main floor rather than hidden away in an attic. She unpacked methodically, arranging her belongings in their new places, the challenge coins displayed on a shelf where morning light would catch their polished surfaces, service photographs grouped on the wall above her desk, her late husband's letters, returned by David the day after closing along with her retirement, flag, carefully stored in an archival box beside her bed. It wasn't the home she had built over 30 years. It was smaller, temporary, an interim space between chapters. But it was hers, secured through clarity rather than compromise, chosen rather than assigned. That evening, she sat on her small patio, watching the community garden where residents tended shared plots of vegetables and flowers. An older gentleman in a Vietnam-era veteran's cap noticed her and raised a hand in greeting, the gesture carrying the unmistakable crispness of military courtesy. Margaret returned the salute reflexively, the motion ingrained after decades of service. He smiled and returned to his gardening, respecting her privacy while acknowledging their shared background. This, she realized, was what had been missing in those attic months. Not luxury or space or even autonomy, though all had been in short supply. It was recognition, being seen for who she was rather than what she represented to others. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Caldwell, retired but not diminished, a woman who had served her country and raised her son and would now, finally, prioritize herself. Her phone buzzed with a text. David again. Movers coming tomorrow for our things. I found more of your items in storage. Where should I send them? Progress of a sort. Not an apology, not full recognition, but movement in the right direction. She typed back her new address, adding, Thank you. I'm available for coffee next week if you'd like to talk. Small steps toward a recalibrated relationship. Not restoration, too. Much had been revealed for that, but perhaps reconstruction on more honest terms. As twilight settled over the garden, Margaret felt an unexpected sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened. The betrayal still stung, the manipulation still angered her when she allowed herself to dwell on it. But for what had been revealed, both about her family and about herself. They had believed her too diminished to recognize what was happening, too compliant to object, too invested in maternal sacrifice to prioritize her own dignity. They had been wrong. She was not the woman they had relegated to an attic. She was Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Caldwell, who had navigated war zones and raised a son alone and built a home from nothing but military pay and determination, who had recognized a tactical assault on her autonomy and responded not with surrender, but with strategy, who had left her son nothing but the stairs to an empty attic and the opportunity to climb them, to see the limited view they offered, to understand finally what it meant to be reduced to a space someone else decided you deserved. The Veterans Community Garden became Margaret's sanctuary that autumn. Her knee strengthened through daily walks along its winding paths, progress measured not in physical therapy metrics, but in how many beds she could tend before needing rest. The Vietnam vet who'd saluted her that first evening, Walter, she learned, became a steady companion, their conversations flowing easily between gardening tips and military memories. Pentagon or field deployment? He asked one morning as they harvested late tomatoes, the question casual but weighted with shared understanding. Both, Margaret replied, carefully placing a ripe Cherokee purple in her basket. Started at the Pentagon Intelligence Division. Requested field assignment after my husband died. Needed the structure, the purpose. Walter nodded. No further explanation needed. Military life provided framework when personal life crumbled. Something civilians rarely understood. Iraq? He asked. Afghanistan first, then 2 tours in Iraq. You? Mekong Delta, 68 to 70. His hands, spotted with age but still strong, twisted a stubborn tomato from its vine. Different war, same questions. Was it worth it? Did it matter? Will civilians ever understand what we were actually doing there? Margaret appreciated his directness, the absence of the eggshell conversation so many civilians attempted around veterans. No platitudes about service, no awkward thanks, just the straightforward acknowledgement of complicated realities. My son never asked, she said, the admission surprising her as it emerged. About my deployments, what I did, what I saw. It was like that part of me existed in a separate compartment from Mom. Walter's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected understanding. Family often prefers the version of us that fits their narrative. Military service complicates that narrative, makes us harder to categorize as just parent, just spouse, just neighbor, just vulnerable elder to be managed, Margaret added with a wry smile. Ah, Walter said. That explains the moving boxes. Relocating under duress? Relocating under my own terms, Margaret corrected. After a brief period of tactical repositioning by family members who underestimated my strategic capacity. Walter's laugh was genuine, a warm sound that carried across the garden. Always a mistake. Civilians forget we're trained to recognize when we're under siege. That simple validation, the acknowledgement that her response had been proportional to the threat, eased something in Margaret's chest. Beyond James and her, VA support team, Few people understood the full story of her relocation from attic to independence. Walter required no detailed explanation to grasp its outlines. As October deepened toward November, Margaret established routines in her new space. Morning coffee on the patio, watching the garden transition to fall plantings. Physical therapy exercises followed by a walk through the community. Afternoon meetings with financial advisors, housing consultants, and occasionally, social connections, being carefully recultivated after months of isolation. The sale proceeds, wisely invested with guidance from a financial planner specializing in veteran affairs, would support her comfortably while she waited for the veterans' housing development to complete construction. Her application had been prioritized based on her officer rank and service record, moving her projected wait from 2 years to 14 months. In the meantime, the condo served her needs perfectly. Its single-level layout accommodated her recovering knee. Its location provided access to VA medical services and a community of fellow veterans. Its temporary nature gave her space to evaluate what permanent housing features would best serve her long-term independence. David texted weekly, brief messages that carefully avoided mention of Teresa or direct references to the house sale. Updates about his work. Questions about her knee recovery. Once, a photo of a military ceremony he'd attended with a colleague, with the tentative message, "Reminded me of your retirement day. Still have the program somewhere." Margaret responded with equal care, maintaining the open channel without rushing. Reconciliation. She recognized the pattern from post-conflict diplomatic relations, establishing normalized communications before attempting to address deeper issues. Some wounds required time before debridement could begin. Teresa remained conspicuously absent from these exchanges, her silence speaking volumes about where responsibilities lay for the attic relocation and attempted property transfer. Margaret didn't press the issue. The space between them allowed for clarity without the fog of manipulated emotions. 6 weeks after closing, Margaret received an unexpected email from Elaine, Teresa's mother. The subject line read simply, "Apology." Margaret hesitated before opening it, steeling herself for another round of misdirected guilt or subtle accusations. Instead, she found what appeared to be genuine contrition. "Dear Margaret, I've struggled with whether to write this, knowing my role in enabling a situation that caused you pain. When Teresa and David first discussed moving you to the attic temporarily, I should have recognized the red flags. When they mentioned having you sign papers during a good day, I should have questioned their motives rather than offering tactical advice. The truth is, I was focused on what benefited my daughter's material circumstances, not on your dignity or autonomy. For that, I am deeply sorry. David mentioned you're doing well in your new place. I'm glad. You deserved better than an attic room from the people who should have honored your sacrifices most. If you're open to it, I'd welcome the chance to apologize in person. Sincerely, Elaine. Margaret read the message twice, searching for hidden agendas or manipulative undertones. Finding none obvious, she set it aside to consider her response. Unlike David's tentative outreach, this required more careful evaluation. Elaine had been peripherally involved, but had also been the one to reveal the good day strategy that had confirmed Margaret's suspicions. She forwarded the email to James with a single question: tactical or genuine? His response came quickly. Word choice suggests genuine, no attempt to minimize or deflect. Acknowledges specific actions rather than vague misunderstandings. Would recommend cautious engagement if you're comfortable. Margaret considered this assessment. In her military career, she'd learned to value intelligence from unexpected sources. Elaine potentially offered insight into Teresa's thinking, into the family dynamics that had led to Margaret's exile. Not for revenge purposes, but for clarity. Understanding how the situation had evolved could help prevent its recurrence. She replied with a brief message accepting the apology and suggesting coffee the following week at a cafe near the community. Garden, neutral territory where Margaret would have support nearby if needed. The meeting proved surprisingly productive. Elaine arrived alone, dressed simply, without the designer accessories that usually signaled her alignment with Teresa's material values. She seemed smaller somehow, less certain of her position in the world. "Thank you for meeting me," she began after they'd ordered. "I wasn't sure you would." "I appreciate directness," Margaret replied. "Your email suggested you were ready to speak honestly." Elaine nodded, gaze steadying. "After everything happened, the sale, David finding your military items hidden away, Teresa stayed with us for a while. Her version of events shifted daily. First you were confused, making irrational decisions. Then you were vindictive, punishing them for trying to help. Then manipulated by your military friends who wanted your money." She stirred her coffee unnecessarily. "None of it aligned with the Margaret Caldwell I've known for 20 years. The woman who ran evacuation operations during combat deployments doesn't become confused about property transfers." Margaret allowed a small smile at this assessment. "No, she doesn't." The more Teresa talked, the more I recognized the pattern. The same one she's used since childhood when caught in wrongdoing. Deny, deflect, reframe until she's the victim. Elaine sighed. "I enabled it. With Teresa, then with their treatment of you. Stayed silent when I should have spoken up." "Why didn't you?" Margaret asked, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. Elaine considered the question. "Partly maternal instinct, protecting. My child even when she's wrong. Partly self-interest. Their house, your house, was where family gatherings happened, where I saw my grandchildren. Rocking the boat meant potentially losing access." The admission was surprisingly candid. Margaret recognized the calculation, the weighing of moral discomfort against practical consequences. She'd seen similar rationalizations during her military career, officers choosing not to report misconduct to preserve unit cohesion or career trajectories. "I understand the impulse," Margaret acknowledged, "though not the outcome." "David's different now," Elaine offered. "The house sale, finding your military items hidden away, it forced a reckoning. He and Teresa are in counseling, separately and together." Margaret absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally she felt a complex mix of validation and residual hurt. The counseling suggested recognition of wrongdoing, but also emphasized how severely family bonds had fractured if professional intervention was required. "I'm not telling you this to pressure reconciliation," Elaine clarified, seemingly reading Margaret's thoughts. "You don't owe them forgiveness or relationship. I just thought you should know your actions had impact beyond financial consequences." "It was never about punishment," Margaret said after a moment. "It was about establishing boundaries that had been repeatedly violated." "I know that now," Elaine replied. "Though I didn't then. Self-determination isn't punishment, even when it feels that way to those who preferred you dependent." They finished their coffee in thoughtful silence, the conversation having shifted from apology to something approaching mutual understanding. Not friendship, certainly, but a form of respectful recognition. As they prepared to leave, Elaine hesitated. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her purse. "David doesn't know I have this. Teresa kept it after they moved your things." She handed Margaret a small velvet pouch. Inside was a silver locket Margaret had believed lost during her last deployment, a gift from her late husband containing his photo and a lock of their son's baby hair. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, the sentimental value of this small object far outweighing the challenge coins and service medals previously returned. Elaine nodded. It was never hers to keep. The exchange marked a turning point, not in family reconciliation, which remained a distant possibility rather than an immediate goal, but in Margaret's own healing process. The return of the locket, unlike the military items David had brought to the closing, represented a more personal acknowledgement of what had been taken from her. That evening, She sat on her patio watching the sunset paint the community garden in golden light. The locket rested in her palm, its weight familiar yet strange after years of absence. She opened it carefully, revealing the faded photo of her husband in his service uniform, the tiny coil of blonde hair that had long since darkened on her son's adult head. Walter appeared at his usual time, watering can in hand for his evening garden rounds. He nodded a greeting, respecting her contemplative mood without interrupting it. "Family artifacts?" he asked after a few minutes, gesturing toward the locket with his free hand. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Just returned after being misplaced during my relocation." Walter's expression suggested he understood the euphemism. "Important recovery," he said simply. "Personal history anchors identity when others try to redefine us." The observation struck Margaret as profoundly accurate. The attic relocation had been more than physical displacement. It had been an attempt to rewrite her narrative from decorated officer and independent homeowner to dependent elder requiring management. The systematic removal of her military achievements and personal mementos had facilitated that attempted revision. "The Veterans Housing Project reached out today," she mentioned, changing the subject slightly. "Construction is ahead of schedule. They're projecting May occupancy instead of August." "Good timing," Walter noted. "Spring planting, new beginnings." "They've allocated garden plots to each unit," Margaret added. "I've put in a request for one adjacent to the community area. Thought I might establish a demonstration garden for other veterans interested in horticultural therapy." Walter smiled approvingly. "Best recovery tool they never taught us at the VA. Digging in dirt beats digging through trauma any day." The concept had been forming in Margaret's mind for weeks, a way to translate her newfound passion for gardening into something beneficial for fellow veterans. The structure of planning, planting, and nurturing aligned with military precision while providing the therapeutic benefits of working with living things. "I'd welcome your expertise," she said, "if you're interested in consulting." "Haven't had a consulting request since retirement," Walter replied, his tone suggesting pleased surprise. "Be good to have a mission again, even a peaceful one." They discussed preliminary ideas as the sun dipped below the horizon: raised beds designed for accessibility, plant selections that could withstand occasional neglect during health setbacks, irrigation systems that maximized efficiency. The conversation flowed with easy camaraderie, two officers approaching a new objective with complementary skill sets. Later, as Margaret prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, I have some more of your things from storage, including photo albums I think you might want. Can I bring them by sometime this week?" The request represented another small step, not just returning her possessions, but seeking permission to enter her space, rather than assuming access. Margaret considered it carefully before responding. Thursday afternoon would work. Coffee on the patio if weather permits. Setting physical and temporal boundaries, a specific day, a defined space, an implied time limit, while still opening the door to continued communication. Tactical engagement on her terms. She placed the locket on her nightstand beside her service photo and her husband's letters. Tangible reminders of a life fully lived, of an identity earned through service and sacrifice, of a strength her family had temporarily forgotten but would never discount again. As she drifted toward sleep, Margaret reflected on the contrast between her current circumstances and those of just a few months ago. The attic room with its sloped ceiling and tiny window had been presented as protection, but functioned as isolation. Her current home, though temporary, offered connection to fellow veterans, to her authentic identity, to a future shaped by her own choices rather than others' convenience. The path forward remained complex. Family reconciliation would require time, boundaries, and genuine acknowledgement rather than strategic apologies. Her long-term housing situation was secure, but not immediate. Her knee continued to heal, but would never regain its youthful resilience. Yet, for the first time since discovering those transfer documents in David's desk, Margaret felt not just determined, but peaceful. She had weathered the assault on her autonomy not by surrendering or by scorched earth tactics, but by strategic recalibration. By recognizing the battlefield, identifying the objective, and deploying appropriate resources to secure her position. Military training, it seemed, had prepared her for more than combat zones and Pentagon politics. It had equipped her to defend her most personal territory, her right to age with dignity on her own terms. When David arrived Thursday with her photo albums and remaining possessions, he would find not a bitter woman nursing grievances, but a lieutenant colonel who had secured her position and established clear rules of engagement. Who was open to diplomatic relations but would never again surrender territory, physical or psychological, to those who confused vulnerability with weakness. Who had left him nothing but stairs to an empty attic, and in doing so, had taught the most valuable lesson a strategic commander could offer: underestimate your opponent at your own peril. David arrived promptly at 3 on Thursday, his arms full with 2 large photo albums and a cardboard box balanced precariously on top. Margaret watched his approach from her patio, noting the careful way he navigated the garden path, how he'd dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual business attire. Small adjustments that suggested thought had been given to this meeting. "The gate's unlocked," she called when he hesitated at the entrance. "You can set those on the table." He did so with evident relief, arranging the items neatly before stepping back, hands in pockets, uncertainty in his stance. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. "Coffee's fresh," she said, indicating the carafe on the small side table. "Still take it black?" "Yes. Thank you." He poured himself a cup, movements measured, as if in unfamiliar territory requiring careful navigation. "The place looks nice. Suits you." Margaret allowed a small smile. "It does. Single level, accessible, good natural light, all the features the attic lacked." David winced, but didn't attempt to defend the indefensible. Progress of a sort. "I found these in the basement storage," he said, touching the photo albums. "And some other things I thought you'd want. Service commendations, your college diploma, Dad's dog tags." Margaret opened the top album, finding photos from David's childhood chronologically arranged. School pictures, sports teams, family holidays, a visual history of their life together. She turned pages slowly, memories surfacing with each image. "You saved everything," David observed, watching her. "Military habit," Margaret replied. "Document the mission, preserve the record." She paused at a photo of David at 7, proudly wearing a plastic helmet from a costume shop. "You wanted to be a soldier that Halloween." "Like Mom," David nodded, his expression softening. "I did. Carried your spare flashlight as my tactical equipment. Thought I was so official." "You were," Margaret said. "Most dedicated private in the neighborhood patrol." A moment of shared remembrance stretched between them, bridging some of the distance recent events had created. Not erasing it. That would require more than nostalgic reminiscence, but acknowledging the deeper history that existed alongside the betrayal. David cleared his throat. "Teresa and I found an apartment, near her parents. It's temporary until we figure out next steps." He hesitated. "We're not doing well. After everything." Margaret maintained her neutral expression. "I'm sorry to hear that." Not false sympathy, but the measured acknowledgement of another human's difficulty without accepting responsibility for it. "Her father thinks we should sue you," David continued, watching for her reaction. "For the house. Claims we had an oral agreement about inheritance, that the sale was improper." "Does he?" Margaret said, voice even. "Not a question. I told him no." David met her eyes directly for the first time. What happened was wrong. What we did, what I did, was wrong. No, justification changes that. The admission hung in the garden air, unadorned by excuses or qualifications. Margaret sipped her coffee, giving the moment the weight it deserved. "That's a start," she said finally. I don't expect forgiveness, David added quickly. I just want you to know I see it now. The attic, the transfer documents, the way I treated you. Like you were a problem to solve rather than my mother. Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the recognition without offering absolution. That would come later, if at all, after consistent demonstration rather than momentary insight. The Veterans Housing Development called, she said, changing course. Construction is ahead of schedule. I'll be moving in May. That's good, David replied, accepting the shift. Permanent place, designed for veterans. You'll have community there. I already do. Margaret gestured toward the garden where Walter was methodically pruning autumn vegetation. Fellow officers who understand certain realities civilians often miss. David followed her gaze. Like what? Margaret considered the question, searching for words a civilian might comprehend. Like how strength doesn't negate vulnerability, but transforms it. How support differs from control. How respect isn't just language but action. I want to learn that, David said quietly. Not for reconciliation, though I hope for that eventually, but because I should have known it already. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing beneath the contrition a glimmer of the boy who had once wanted to be a soldier like her. Who had understood, at least in childhood, that her military service represented strength rather than something to be hidden away. In an attic. Start by remembering who I am, she said. Not who you assumed I'd become. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Caldwell, David said, the title carrying new respect in his voice. Bronze Star recipient, Intelligence Operations Commander, the officer who coordinated the evacuation of 300 civilians during the Kandahar offensive. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You've been doing research. I should have done it years ago, David acknowledged. Asked questions, listened to the answers, seen you as more than just mom. Both identities matter, Margaret corrected. I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of being your mother. Neither diminishes the other. They talked for another hour as afternoon drifted toward evening. Not solving everything, that would require more time, more conversations, more consistent recognition, but establishing a foundation for potential rebuilding. As David prepared to leave, he hesitated by the gate. Can I come again? Maybe next week? I'd like to hear about your deployment sometime, if you're willing to share it. Thursday afternoon's work, Margaret said, setting a boundary while leaving the door open. Bring your own coffee next time. Hazelnut. I remember you liked that. After he left, Walter wandered over from his gardening, tactfully having kept his distance during the visit. Family reconciliation? He asked, settling into the chair David had vacated. Family recalibration, Margaret corrected, finding the proper distance from which to engage. Walter nodded approvingly. Good tactical position. Close enough for communication. Far enough for security. Margaret smiled at the military framing that so perfectly captured her approach. Exactly. As twilight descended on the garden, painting the autumn foliage in deepening gold, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From attic exile to independent living. From being managed to reclaiming command. From silent acquiescence to strategic empowerment. The path hadn't been linear or simple. There had been pain in recognizing betrayal, courage in confronting it, determination in charting a new course. Yet through it all, her military training had provided the framework for responding to attack not with surrender but with strategy. You know, Walter said, breaking the companionable silence, your story reminds me of something my commanding officer once told me. The greatest weapon in any arsenal is the refusal to accept defeat even when others have already written your surrender. Margaret nodded, feeling the truth of those words in her bones. She had refused the surrender implied by that attic room, refused to sign away her home and dignity, refused to accept the diminished version of herself her family had tried to impose. And in that refusal, that quiet, determined stand for her. Own worth. She had found not just housing, but home. Not just independence, but community. Not just existence, but purpose. Her son had moved her to the attic for her safety. She had sold the house and left him the stairs, and in doing so had taught them both the most important lesson of her military career. Never underestimate an opponent, especially one who has spent a lifetime preparing for battles on multiple fronts. If you've ever had to stand your ground when others tried to diminish your worth, this story is for you. If you've faced the painful realization that family sometimes values convenience over dignity, you're not alone. And if you've found the courage to reclaim your narrative when others tried to rewrite it, I celebrate your victory with you. Share your own stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below. How did you respond when others underestimated your strength or tried to relegate you to spaces that didn't honor your worth? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation, resilience, and the quiet power that comes from refusing to surrender your dignity, no matter what stairs others try to confine you to. Remember, your life is yours to command. Stand your ground, know your worth, and never let anyone move you to an attic when you've earned the right to the home you've built.